My name is Alina Rahman, and I am 28 years old. I live in Sacramento, California, with my parents, in the same house I grew up in. I finished my degree in business administration 6 years ago and worked for almost 2 years at a marketing firm downtown, a job I actually loved, before I had to leave it when my mother's health started getting worse. She has a heart condition that needs careful attention, and since I am the youngest of 4 children and my 3 older siblings are all married with their own households and children to manage, the responsibility of caring for her fell mostly on me. I don't regret that decision. My mother is everything to me, and I would make the same choice again without hesitation. But 5 years have passed since then, and somewhere in the middle of caring for her, I also started looking for my own future, hoping to get married and build a family of my own eventually. What I didn't expect was how exhausting that search would become. Those first months after leaving my job were harder than I let myself admit at the time. I missed the structure of it, the small satisfaction of finishing a project, the coworkers who used to bring me coffee on rough mornings. I told myself the sacrifice was temporary, that once my mother's condition stabilized, I would find my way back to something resembling my old life. Instead, the caregiving became a permanent rhythm, doctor's appointments woven into every week, medication schedules I knew better than my own daily habits. Somewhere in that new rhythm, I started thinking more seriously about marriage, partly because I genuinely wanted a partner and a family of my own, and partly, if I'm honest, because I was tired of being the only sibling whose life seemed to be standing still while everyone else's moved steadily forward. My older sister, Hina, has always helped me screen proposals before I speak with anyone seriously. That was my rule from the very beginning, something I made clear to every single man I spoke with. I would tell them plainly, right at the start of any conversation, that I would first send their information to Hina, and only after both families expressed real interest would things move forward properly. I thought this rule would protect me from wasting time on people who weren't serious. For a while, I believed it was working. The first real disappointment came almost immediately, though I didn't fully recognize the pattern yet. A man named Farouk, introduced through a family friend, seemed pleasant enough during our first few messages, asking about my education and my hobbies. Within a week, though, the conversation shifted entirely toward what he called his preferences, describing in detail the specific body type and appearance he expected in a wife, as though he were describing a car he wanted to purchase rather than a person he hoped to marry. I ended that conversation within a day. I told myself it was simply bad luck, one disappointing person among many good ones I hadn't met yet. But over the following years, the same pattern repeated itself so often that I eventually stopped being surprised by it, only tired. Man after man, introduced through family friends, matrimonial websites, or relatives eager to see me settled, would begin every conversation politely enough, only to steer things, sooner or later, towards something that had nothing to do with building an actual marriage. I kept a private list on my phone at one point, not out of bitterness exactly, but almost as a way of proving to myself that I wasn't imagining the pattern. 9 names by the end of the 3rd year, each one accompanied by a short note about how the conversation had eventually gone wrong. Some were blunt about it almost immediately. Others took weeks to reveal themselves, which somehow felt worse, because by then I had usually let my guard down at least partway, allowing myself to imagine, briefly, that this particular conversation might turn out differently than all the ones before it. 2 years ago, I spoke with a man named Cameron for almost a month, longer than I usually allowed any conversation to continue without family involvement, because he seemed genuinely different at first, thoughtful, and patient in his questions. Then, during what I thought was an ordinary evening conversation, he mentioned almost casually that he expected his future wife to send him certain kinds of photographs before marriage, just so he could be sure he found her attractive enough to commit. I blocked his number that same night, feeling a familiar, hollow disappointment settle over me, the same feeling I'd had after Farrokh, and after several others whose names I've mostly managed to forget. The most recent one, just 2 months ago, hurt more than most, because for a while, I genuinely believed he might be different. His name was Rayon, introduced through my aunt, who knew his mother from their local mosque community. He spoke carefully during our first conversations, mentioning his prayers, his respect for his own mother, his hope to build a household grounded in real faith rather than empty appearances. He even said, more than once, that he considered himself a man of strong character, someone who took his responsibilities seriously. I let myself relax a little, cautiously, the way I always tried not to, given everything I had already learned to expect. I remember telling my mother about him after our third conversation, something I rarely did that early, because I usually preferred to wait until I had a clearer sense of someone before mentioning them at all. She had smiled, genuinely pleased, asking small questions about his family and his work as a pharmacy technician. I had gone to bed that night allowing myself something I hadn't felt in a long while, a small, careful hope that this one might actually be different from the rest. If you are enjoying this story so far, please like this video and subscribe for more emotional English stories. Now, let's continue. Then, about 2 weeks into our conversations, while he was also asking to speak with my family and expressing interest in moving things forward properly, he began mentioning, gradually at first, certain things he expected from me before any formal engagement was finalized. He wanted me to send him photographs he described as more personal than what I was comfortable sharing. He brought up private fantasies he wanted to discuss with me directly, framing it as something couples should be honest about early, before committing to marriage. I told him clearly, the first time it came up, that I wasn't comfortable with any of that, and that these were not conversations I was willing to have before marriage, if ever in that manner at all. He apologized, seemed to understand, and for a few days the conversation returned to safer topics. Then it would happen again. The same requests phrased slightly differently, always framed as reasonable, always presented alongside his continued interest in speaking with my family formally. There was one exchange in particular that stayed with me longer than the others. He had written, late one evening, that he simply wanted to be certain we were compatible in every way before involving our families in something as serious as an engagement, as though what he was asking for was simply due diligence rather than something that made my stomach turn every time I read it. I remember staring at that message for a long time, trying to figure out how someone could genuinely believe that framing made the request reasonable. The contradiction confused me more than anything else. How could someone genuinely want to involve both families, to do things the right way, while also pushing daily for things that had nothing to do with a respectful courtship at all? I finally blocked his number one evening, exhausted and disheartened in a way that felt heavier than usual, and sat on my bed afterward, staring at my phone, wondering if I had simply been unlucky again and again, or if this was genuinely what most men were like beneath their careful first impressions. I called Hina that same night, crying harder than I expected to, the frustration of 5 years finally spilling out all at once. Is this just how it's going to be? I asked her. Every single time, no matter how careful I am, no matter how clearly I explain my boundaries from the start? Tell me exactly what happened, Hina said, and I could hear her moving into another room, away from her husband and kids, giving me her full attention, the way she always did, whenever I called sounding like this. I told her everything, the photographs, the fantasies, the strange contradiction of him wanting to speak with our family while pushing for those things almost daily. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and I could picture her exactly, sitting on the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her forehead the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something. Hina was quiet for a moment before answering. I don't think this is about all men, Alina. I think it's about the specific way you've been finding them. Casual introductions, unsupervised messaging for weeks before any real family involvement. That setup makes it easy for the wrong kind of person to slip through and take advantage of the space before anyone else is watching. But I always tell them up front that I'll send their information to you, I said. That's supposed to be the safeguard. Telling them isn't the same as actually doing it immediately, Hina said gently. You've been letting these conversations run for days, sometimes weeks, before actually looping me in properly. That gap is exactly where this keeps happening. I think we need to change the process itself, not just your intentions within it. I just don't understand why every single one of them ends up asking for the same kinds of things, I said, my voice cracking. Am I giving off some kind of signal without realizing it? Is there something about how I talk to people that makes them think this is acceptable? Absolutely not, Hina said firmly. This isn't about anything you're doing wrong. Some people specifically look for situations with less oversight, because it's easier to push boundaries there. That's not a reflection of you. It's a reflection of the space you've been giving them to work with, without meaning to. The following week, Hina suggested we try something different. Instead of casual introductions through family friends or dating apps designed for casual matching, she connected me with a respected matchmaker in our community named Aunt Samina, a retired school teacher known for her careful, old-fashioned approach to introductions. Aunt Samina insisted on speaking with both families thoroughly before any direct conversation between the two people involved was even allowed to begin, checking references, meeting parents in person, and only then arranging a supervised first conversation, always with a family member present or aware of every exchange from the very start. I was skeptical at first, worried the process would feel restrictive or old-fashioned in ways that didn't match how I actually wanted to get to know someone. I remember sitting across from Aunt Samina at her kitchen table during our first meeting, her sharp eyes studying me carefully as she asked question after question, not just about what I was looking for in a husband, but about what had gone wrong so many times before. She wrote notes in a small spiral notebook, the kind I hadn't seen anyone use in years, and I found myself oddly comforted by how seriously she seemed to be taking the whole process. I've matched over 40 couples this way, she told me, closing the notebook with a small, satisfied nod. The families that skip the careful parts, hoping to move faster, always seem to run into exactly the kind of trouble you're describing. Slow and careful isn't old-fashioned, beta. It's just thorough. But after everything I had been through, I was also desperate enough to try something different. 3 months later, Aunt Samina introduced our family to Ibrahim, a structural engineer originally from Fresno, now working in Sacramento, whose mother had specifically asked Aunt Samina to help find someone serious about building a genuine partnership rather than simply going through the motions of matchmaking. Our families met first, over a long dinner at my parents' house, before Ibrahim and I were ever allowed to speak privately at all. I remember watching him that evening, the way he listened carefully when my father spoke, the way he helped clear the table afterward without anyone asking him to, small details that meant more to me, after everything I had learned to watch for, than any single carefully chosen sentence could have. When we finally did talk, with Hina sitting nearby during that first conversation exactly as promised, Ibrahim asked me thoughtful questions about my time caring for my mother, about what I had studied in college, about what kind of life I actually hoped to build rather than what I looked like, or what I might be willing to share with him before marriage. When our conversation eventually turned toward more personal topics weeks later, it stayed entirely within boundaries that felt comfortable and respectful, never once drifting toward anything I hadn't invited myself. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I said to him one evening, several weeks into getting to know him. "I need you to understand why I might seem more guarded than other women you may have spoken with before." I told him everything, or at least the shape of it, the years of disappointing conversations, the pattern I had grown to expect and dread in equal measure, including what had happened with Ration just months before Aunt Samina had introduced us. Ibrahim listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. "I'm genuinely sorry that happened to you, repeatedly, over so many years," he said. "I think some men convince themselves that wanting to know someone before marriage justifies pushing for things that have nothing to do with actually knowing a person's character. It's a kind of excuse people use to ask for things they know, deep down, they shouldn't be asking for, especially not before any real commitment exists." "So why does it keep happening?" I asked. "Am I just finding the wrong men, over and over?" "I think you were finding them in the wrong way," Ibrahim said carefully. "Not because anything was wrong with you, but because casual, unsupervised introductions make it easy for people to test boundaries slowly, hoping nobody else is watching closely enough to notice. The process your sister set up this time, involving both families properly from the very beginning, makes that kind of testing much harder to get away with. It's not that every man is like the ones you dealt with before. It's that the setup you were using before made it too easy for those particular men to reach you." Sitting with that explanation, I felt something settle in me that hadn't settled in years, a sense that my exhaustion and my confusion hadn't been unreasonable after all, and that the problem had never really been about my own judgment failing repeatedly, but about a process that had left too much room for exactly the kind of behavior I kept encountering. Our families finalized the engagement 2 months later, following a nikah that felt, to me, entirely different from anything I had feared might never happen after years of disappointment. Standing beside Ibrahim afterward, surrounded by both of our families celebrating together, I thought about the version of myself who had cried on the phone with Hina after blocking Rayan's number, convinced that every man eventually revealed the same disappointing pattern underneath a decent first impression. That version of myself had been exhausted, but she hadn't been wrong to keep her boundaries firm, even when it meant walking away again and again. She just hadn't yet found the right process to protect those boundaries properly, the kind of process that finally let someone genuine reach her, instead of only the ones bold enough to keep testing the limits of an unsupervised conversation. Hina found me later that evening, standing near the edge of the reception hall while Ibrahim was pulled into photographs with his cousins. She wrapped an arm around my shoulder, the two of us watching the room together for a quiet moment. 5 years, I said, shaking my head slightly. I almost gave up more times than I can count. But you didn't, Hina said. You kept the same standards through every single disappointment, even when it would have been easier to just lower them and settle for whoever came along next. That's not nothing, Alina. That's actually the hardest part. I still don't fully understand why it took so long to find the right approach, I admitted. Aunt Samina's process isn't complicated. It's just careful. Careful takes longer, Hina said. But it also filters out exactly the kind of people who rely on things moving quickly before anyone else notices what they're actually asking for. You didn't waste those 5 years, even though I know it felt that way most days. You were learning exactly what you needed to watch for, so that when the right process finally came along, you knew precisely how to use it. I looked across the room at Ibrahim, laughing at something his younger cousin had said, entirely unaware he was being watched. It was such a small, ordinary moment, and yet it meant more to me than any grand romantic gesture could have, precisely because it was so unremarkable, so free of anything performed for my benefit. For the first time in 5 long years, I finally let myself stop waiting for the disappointment I had grown so used to expecting. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.